So my name is Livia Polanyi, and oddly enough, many years ago, I wrote a book called Telling the American Story, which is actually about the constraints, the linguistic, social, interactional, and cultural constraints on oral storytelling, conversational storytelling. And so I think there are some very interesting issues when one thinks about how how things worked uh, how things work with oral storytelling with actual people who are telling actual stories as the tellers versus what happens when, in fact, all of us tell stories all the time in conversation about what happens. But so that was just a very interesting kind of thing. And the whole question of orality will actually enter into this as well. So this is a short note. It says on writing letters. Uh, and letters in this presentation is basically refers both to actual letters or characters or uh, uh, syllabaries or whatever, which people use essentially to put one after another to make a word and then put those words one after another. Uh, and it will also refers to the idea of actual letters that people write. So starting off, we had cuneiform, which obviously the technology involved there was quite quite elaborate and very much restricted to a very few people. When we moved on to working with letters that were that people sent in documents, which were on paper or parchment or whatever. But when we think about people actually sending letters to each other, well, there was this technology that of the scribe. You would go to a scribe, and that was the technology you used actually to write letters to people. Um, and that persisted, in fact, it persists to this day with people who are illiterate. But in general, what has happened is that literacy has passed on. And so the kind of technology that was involved there was really the knowledge of knowing how to write, but also the development of lightweight pens, paper, that sort of thing. That in the middle of towards the end of the 19th century, of course, we had the invention of the typewriter and the use of the typewriter, and also at that time the development of the dictaphone at the beginning of the very, very beginning of the 20th century. And what's happened then is where we are now, essentially, which is we have done away with a lot of technology uh, when it comes, for example, to writing letters. Okay, people don't buy stamps anymore. Okay, uh, so what we do is we, sit there and print them out, or uh, most likely use email. So then the question is sort of what's going on in the future. So this actually started with my thinking about, well, when was the last time I actually got a real letter? And when was the time I actually wrote a real letter? And, you know, no, we get all this stuff in the mail, okay, marks on paper, as it was called a Xerox. But when was the last time you got a letter that was actually people telling you about stuff? That wasn't like a birth announcement or, a legal document or something. So I was thinking, about that. And so what's happening now, of course, is that all that stuff that we did interactionally, a lot of that now we're doing on text. And that's true kind of all over the world, that people are doing it, texting each other the kinds of things. But still, the way that's working, right? Letters in one sense, but one letter character at a time, basically to get the message across. And of course, what we have with kids is that they're all over the world. Children are basically growing up in entirely digital environments where text, email, that kind of thing is you know, we're not even talking about obviously images and things of that sort, but just at the moment of talking about letters. So what's going on then? So as we move then into this idea of the future, and particularly in virtual reality. So one of the things that I found really amazing is that there are all, I mean, I'm not a VR person at all. So finding out that there were large numbers of proposals for keyboards and how you deal with a keyboard to get this one letter at a time thing that's going to turn into a text. And I kind of wondered, how much sense does that actually make? Really? Now, adopting new technologies has always involved abandoning some kind of perceived affordances of old technologies, right? So basically, you got a lot of stuff out of that scribe. Okay, first of all, he did the work. No spelling problems. You didn't have to provide the paper and so on. So we always have to give up affordances from one situation when we go into an entirely new technology. And so in a world essentially of increasing conversational AI and oral interfaces, it really seems to me to be a little silly to be divided. I mean, I've been amazed. I mean, if you type in, keyboard, keyboards in VR, I mean, really odd. So
Need to wind down.
no problem. So I'm a linguist. I've spent a lot of time in, and people actually think I'm a computational linguist, which is kind of hilarious, but I've lived a lot of my life in the NLP community. And so really, I'm back to orality on this one. I think that there's going to be a lot of use for speech input through speech recognition, but then, of course, also natural language processing, because one of the things actually that I found when I was at Microsoft, talking to the top people in speech recognition, I was very surprised that they didn't actually seem to understand that the problem was not only recognizing speech, because if the problem was actually getting speech to text, that was the only problem. They would have been, we would have been talking to computers and getting our information out of nothing, for years. So actually the problem obviously is understanding the text. We can then imagine understanding what has been processed. So we're not doing this anymore. We're doing what we normally do. And so the idea, people are still going to write letters. Tuk, tuk, tuk. Here are a few things. But my point is, composing text by entering one letter at a time in virtual reality, I just don't think is going to be the way it's going to work. Dictating, reading, editing, absolutely. But one letter at a time in order to compose your text, I think is at an end.
Thank you.
No, that's my mind. So if there are any questions, let's do that.
I'm just going to take this before you sit down. Just that point.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. And as you said, a really good follow on from like the previous one as well. So I'm going to ask you maybe kind of the same question someone asked me, which was about dialogue. I was thinking about how Walter Jeong talks about how writing is a technology that restructures thought, and every kind of technology we have kind of maybe frames the way we think about conversation. Like letter writing is you write a whole bunch and then maybe a couple of weeks later you get a response. And then text is relatively immediate. You know, you write a couple of sentences and you get a response quickly. So how do you feel like this kind of future of text is restructuring dialogue and conversation?
Well, it's one of the, actually one of the interesting things about, if you will, computationally mediated interaction is, even things with text and whatever, is that there is an asynchronous aspect to it.
Yeah.
And when there's an asynchronous aspect, that does actually some very strange things. I mean, one of the things it does is it changes the meaning, for example, of words like now.
Mm.
Uh, and certain kinds of things, like, for example, the reference of pronouns can get screwed up, which actually does not happen, with almost no exceptions in ordinary conversation. That's been the last, after oral story, after conversational storytelling, I actually got into questions like what's going on in now, and then ended up building a essentially formal model of the structure of discourse, which sort of accounts for a lot of this stuff. So, yeah, I mean, the thing about textual representation of speech, okay,
Sorry.
is that there's actually a lot which is not going on as people text, for example. And one of the things that I think is very interesting, and we all sort of noticed it, is when we are in let's call it a conversation, a text conversation. You've happily, put in your text, and then you see that this other person is, and then suddenly it disappears, right? So there's possibilities, for example, of correction, which is not a possibility in a purely, if you will, oral interactive environment.
Yeah.
And so then I think that whole business is exceedingly interesting, and actually relates to the point that you made about flattening. Okay, because there's a lot that goes on in normal interaction, which cannot be flattened after the case, even though, no, I didn't mean to say that. I didn't mean that Freudian slip, and so on.
Yeah.
Anyhow, that's, I think there's a long conversation we can have.
Yeah,
perhaps
definitely.
Not here. Yeah.
Just going to unshare the screen so I can see you.
Yeah.
Hmm?
Oh, Brandel has a question online. But you're actually after Fabienne. He ran in front of you.
Okay.
I'll be. So I'm guilty of that. Like, I did also re-implement in XOR my keyboard to type letter by letter. So I'm part of the problem. Sorry.
The solution, but not
well,
the final solution.
No, not yet.
Let's not go there.
Well, but I'm going to argue it's a wrong step because it works. It's terrible, but it works. And sadly, now that it works, I'm like, well, I mean, I could do better, but I'll have to actually think, and it's hard. So I really recommend, if you want to explore this, like any other solution, micro gesture or speech or whatnot, don't have a fallback with a keyboard, like a bad one, or even a physical one also, because then you fall back to it and then
You forgot to introduce yourself.
So hello everyone, I'm Fabien Benetou. I build prototypes at the European Parliament, especially on XR for knowledge management, because I'm pretty sure that's one of the most interesting, exciting interface that works today, since I brought in my backpack a couple of $100 headset and it's just there. But yeah, that being said, how to not just type also and input, but edit actually after, it's it becomes one of the most interesting questions because it's one of the most interesting interface, but I don't have an answer either.
Yeah, I think that the how shall I say? There are affordances, okay, for editing where keyboards may very well be useful. So the real question here, which I find, is thinking about, not that you are going to lose certain kinds of affordances when you introduce a new technology, that you shouldn't necessarily impose, old solutions with their affordances. But what that is going to mean is that you're going to have to innovate to be able to capture new affordances to do jobs which you were doing in using the old technology.
So I see Fabian there, but I'm actually going to jump in a little bit before. And also after Livia, it's going to be, since he didn't get to do his opening statement, he's going to do his leaving statement because he has to go next. And also, if you're presenting online, you'll be presenting after lunch. We want to make sure we can hear you, which will be useful. I just want to thank both of the last two speakers, because if this was a year ago and you came in here and talked about voice, I would be really stressed and angry. But what is happening now is much more interesting. I always thought of text as being something that can be force multiplied by other media, but that was primarily images. You put a word in a picture, that's a bit obvious. So what I'm hearing about the different kinds of oralities, an orality where you are illiterate is of course completely different. You don't even space the words the same, right? And what you're talking about here going into this new space, I'm so grateful for this dialogue, because we need to, just like we're talking about the definition of hypertext or hypermedia, we need to shed all those stupid terms and really look at, when is it actually best to do this and how can it be combined? So if you have any further comments, I'm happy, but it was mostly a gratitude for this dimension to the dialogue today.
Well, just to make one other comment, I'm a totally text person myself. And so it was only because the topic here was virtual reality that I began actually to be thinking about this particular issue of essentially text input.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, Brandel, sorry. I think I may have even muted you. Please come back.
Yeah, thank you. Your reminder of the function of the scribes in a sort of an intermediate oral tradition just set my mind afire with what the sort of covert function of a scribe was also to help communicate and craft a message, as well as simply be responsible for the transcription. And it made me think about the scribal traditions that we both may have in a future environment where people are able to write, but they're not necessarily able to perform or communicate a message as eloquently within sort of a modern pervasive hypermedia. But also we have scribal folks who do things like diagram or illustrate already. So there's already a rich contemporary tradition where we are interposing these scribal functions. So I'm very excited by that, but I'm wondering what other points of reference you would draw on in order to reimagine that sort of intermediating function within a context where nominally we all have the same capabilities to use these things, but some of us are better at making those messages happen than others.
Yeah, well, one of the things that in my presentation, of course, went by very fast, but there was this little thing of ChatGPT, right? And essentially the danger of that kind of technology for being seen as some kind of digital scribal knowledge source. Okay, so when you were actually there with your scribe, and if you're lucky and have a really good patent attorney, they will also ask you the right question about what didn't you mean? And it was like, oh, yes, I did. And yeah, so there's, that other person, yes, you could perfectly well say, gee, I am writing, to my mother-in-law and she doesn't like me. Should I, what words should we use? Or, so that scribe had a lot, was part of the technology base of that scribe, was to have this knowledge that they could give to you. And of course we have a very important scribe, and I don't know about all of the legal systems outside of the United States, but in courtrooms in the United States, essentially the document of record is a transcribed, it's transcribed by a person.
And we're done. We have to finish.
Okay, it seems to be that I'm being yanked off the stage, and yeah, thank you for your attention.
So now it's Ben's comments and Gabo, you're after that, right?
Yeah.
And then we're getting close to lunch, so that's good.
So